Okay, Yom Tov again, everybody. Jeremiah chapter 47. This is the second of the chapters of what we discussed last week, the prophecies to the nations, which was a fulfillment of what Jeremiah is told in his kind of foundation prophecy in chapter 1, in which God tells him that God is appointing him to be a prophet to the nations. Um, the language is Hifkaraticha hayom hazeh al hagoyim va'al hamamlachot. I appoint you this day over nations and kingdoms. That's Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 10. And it's very interesting to note that Rashi actually comments there, seems to indicate that these nations may actually refer only to the Jewish people, which is sometimes called a goy, and that maybe it's actually, even though it sounds like it's talking about all the nations, maybe somehow it's actually really talking about the Jewish people, which of course are the focus of the book of Jeremiah, but we have this handful of chapters about other nations. And we started with Egypt last week, which was a rather lengthy chapter. Now, this week, we're going to move on to chapter 47, a very short chapter about Gaza, about the Philistines and Aza. And then after that, we have a very, very long chapter about Moab. But keeping with our theme of one chapter a week, more or less, we'll just tackle the Philistine chapter and take as much time as we want to take with it. So let me share my screen. This is Jeremiah chapter 47 for those who have brown JPS Tanachs in front of you. Don't know if that's anybody. I'm solo here in the building this morning on this very cold day, but hope everybody's warm wherever you are. But if you do have a brown JPS Tanakh in front of you, as I finish turning the pages here, that is page 1126 in these brown JPS Tanachs, Jeremiah chapter 47. And let us look together. There we go. Let's see. Elaine, would you read for us?
Yes, the word of the Lord that came to the prophet Jeremiah concerning the Philistines before Pharaoh conquered Gaza. Thus said the Lord, see, waters are rising from the north. They shall become a raging torrent. They shall flood the land and its creatures, the towns and their inhabitants. Men shall cry out, all the inhabitants of the land shall howl. At the clatter of the stamping hoofs of his stallions, at the noise of his chariots, the rumbling of their wheels, fathers shall not look to their children out of sheer helplessness. Because of the day that is coming for ravaging all the Philistines, for cutting off every last ally of Tyre and Sidon, for the Lord will ravage the Philistines, the remnant from the island of Kaftor. Baldness has come upon Gaza. Ashkelon is destroyed. O remnant of their valley, how long will you gash yourself? O sword of the Lord, when will you be quiet at last? Withdraw into your sheath, rest and be still. How can it be quiet when the Lord has given it orders against Ashkelon and the seacoast, given it assignment there?
Okay, so this is our short chapter. Um, and the first thing we have to notice and understand is who is the enemy or who is the destroyer that is coming to the Philistines. And we'll take a couple minutes, in a few moments, just to talk about who the Philistines are as we read through the chapter to try to understand them and their place. But there's something very strange in the beginning of the chapter, which is at first it says, the word of the Lord to Jeremiah concerning the Philistines, El Plishtim, Beterem Yakeh Pharaoh et Aza, before Pharaoh conquers Gaza. So we expect that this prophecy is a prophecy about how Paro is going to come and destroy or conquer Gaza. Then it continues, thus says the Lord, Hine maim olim mitzafon, v'hayu nachal shotef, v'yishtafu eretz umloa, etc. Waters are rising from the north. This, of course, yet again evokes Jeremiah chapter 1, in which the second prophecy that Jeremiah gets after the almond branch is a steaming pot tipped away from the north. And God says that that means that disaster is going to break loose from the north. Here, too, in our chapter, we have the same basic message, which is a destructive water, a raging torrent of water is going to flood from the north, and that's going to be the destruction of Gaza. So, when we talk in Jeremiah about the north, who are we usually referring to?
Babylon.
Exactly, Babylon. And that does seem like it's what the subject of this chapter is. It's about the Babylonian destruction, which is going to come to the Philistines in Gaza. But if that's the case, then why does the chapter locate itself as before Pharaoh conquered Gaza? It's a strange thing. We would have expected the word of the Lord that came to the prophet Jeremiah before the Babylonians, laid waste to Gaza. And here is the prophecy about the destruction of Gaza at the hands of the Babylonians that's going to come. Or we would have expected the word of the Lord came to the prophet Jeremiah before Pharaoh conquered Gaza. Behold, the great Pharaoh is coming upon you and will, destroy your area. So why put the timestamp as Pharaoh and then the prophecy be about the Babylonian destruction? We've got time for class participations. Any takes or thoughts on this question? Why open up the chapter by saying that this prophecy was given before Pharaoh conquered Gaza, and then make the prophecy all about the Babylonian destruction? Strange. Lance?
Samson is dancing in heaven.
Samson?
Oh, Samson.
Yes. Say
Is
more.
the one who had the battle with the Philistines?
Yes.
So he's thrilled.
Yes. Well, he would be happy to see the destruction of the Philistines, that's for sure.
And the prophet Nahum would also be thrilled.
Good.
He likes that.
Yes.
And another thought is, this is not what's happening in Gaza today.
Yeah. It's impossible to read this chapter without thinking about the current reality. We'll try to keep that a little bit at bay, but I will say something about that as we go or before the end. But so what the contemporary commentaries suggest is, I'll share my screen just one more time for this, is that in the region, we're talking about a moment, and we're still in Jeremiah's, in the period of Jeremiah's, prophesying, and therefore, it's somewhere in the very late 7th, early 6th century before the Common Era, meaning somewhere between 620 and 580, something like that. And even in the previous chapter about Egypt, we understood that there was a period of time in which Egypt, Paro Necho, was on a kind of regional campaign. And that was, around the 620, 610s, something like that, down to 609, 605, the Battle of Carchemish. And at that moment, the Egyptians were ascendant and they were powerful. And so what some of the commentaries suggest is that this is the word of the Lord that came to the prophet Jeremiah about the Philistines before Paro conquered Gaza, meaning when they expected that the conquest of Gaza would come from Pharaoh. And so the Philistines are seeing an ascendant Egypt and fearing for their welfare from Egypt and Pharaoh. And the prophecy coming from God is actually Egypt is not who you really need to fear. Babylonia is who you really need to fear. And prophecies like that were given to the Israelites also. And so the kind of one of the themes we see here is that God's messages to other nations are not always that different from God's messages to the Israelites, which is, things are not always as they seem. The power at one moment is not always going to be the power that remains. You have to be, astute. And sometimes God sees things that you can't see and offers you a message that could be helpful to you. And if the message is, destruction will come from Babylonia, not Egypt, maybe, again, we don't assume that Jeremiah actually went to Gaza to deliver this prophecy. It may just be really something, about the other nations for the Israelites to listen to and think about. But if there is really a message for the Gazans here, the message is don't be afraid of Egypt. Be afraid of Babylonia and figure out whether there might be a way to form an alliance or, offer tribute to Babylonia to protect yourself. That's who your true enemy is. And so the juxtaposition of the timestamp or framing and the prophecy itself is a way of highlighting who was the perceived power. And God's message is it's not always as it seems. Babylonia is going to be the ultimate threat. We even have we saw a piece earlier in which we saw the Babylonians had laid siege in Judea, and when the Egyptians were kind of on the rise, the Babylonians pulled away for a period of time. And so these are the regional powers at play that are the context of this chapter. I'll also mention just in terms of the placement here, we always ask the question kind of what's the order and arrangement of the book. So we talked about why the prophecies to the other nations might be here at the end of the book. We noticed that we open up with Egypt and we're ultimately going to end with Babylonia. And those are kind of bookends, not just of this region in this time, the time of Jeremiah, but going all the way back to kind of Bereshit. Avraham ultimately kind of departs from Babel and from Babylonia, Mesopotamia, and makes his way to Israel, to Canaan, and the first place he goes is Egypt. After he goes down to Egypt from the famine and comes back and establishes himself, then there's a second famine, and his next trip is to Avimelech Melech Gerar, and that is into the area of the Plishtim. So there is also a kind of Egypt, Gaza, or Egyptian Philistine parallel in the first stories of the founding of the Jewish people with Abraham. Those are the two powers that he's dealing with and with whom he establishes relationships. Each of them has the story about the ruler of that place who Avram is concerned will take Sarah, and so he asks her to say that she's his sister. Those stories kind of play out twice. One is with Paro in Egypt, and one is with Avimelech, then the king or leader of the Plishtim in Gerar. And so again, when we hear Egypt, Gaza and the Plishtim in our Genesis minds in the story of Bereshit is it's kind of the thing that comes next. So maybe that has to do with the placement of this Gaza chapter. Now, something else we want to understand about the Plishtim is that they are not native to the Middle East, so to speak. And this is exactly what the verse means when it says in verse 4. I'll share my screen again. When it says in verse 4, this day is coming to ravage the Philistines, cutting off every last ally of Tyre and Sidon. For the Lord will ravage the Philistines, the remnant from the island of Kaftor, She'erit I Kaftor. So Kaftor, best guess of scholars is that it is Crete or maybe Cyprus, but more likely Crete. And it's a kind of a more Greek-associated area. And the Philistines were believed to be seafaring people who came from the west into the Mediterranean and into the Middle East from Europe. Well, these are obviously before these titles were given. And so, there's an interesting kind of encounter also, that happens over and over again in the books of the prophets. In Judges, as Samson was mentioned, there are many encounters with the Philistines. And, they're people who came from the west. Bnei Israel, were established in Canaan. And then they went to Egypt and they came back out and around and came from the east. So there's sort of this, meeting of the peoples who've come into the land from the east, that's Bnei Israel, and those who've come into the land from the west, those are the Plishtim, who again came from this island of Kaftor, whether it's Crete or what exactly it is, but they are kind of vying for some control in the land, and they establish themselves against along the coast. We know that the area that the Plishtim lived in is the area that's relatively similar to the area of Gaza today. And it has, in that time, it had its major cities, which are mentioned in the early books of the prophets. Let's see what I can remember of them. Ashdod and Ashkelon, Gat and Ekron, and I think there's one more of the 5 Philistine cities. And it's interesting that we see mention, we don't see Gat or Ekron here, but we see mention of Ashkelon here, and the coastal cities. We don't see any mention of Ashdod, but if you look at the descriptions of the destruction, we have the language here in verse 4, Al hayom haba lishdod et kol plishtim, ki shoded Hashem et plishtim. Shoded means to, ransack or spoil, but it may also pillage, but it may also be a literary hint of Ashdod. So, we're getting the cultural setting here of the Philistines and their cities that are going to be destroyed in this destruction. Okay, we could just go back and make our way a little more detailed through the verses and then open it up for thoughts and comments. We might have an early dismissal today. So the word of the Lord that came to the prophet Jeremiah concerning the Plishtim before Paro conquered Gaza. As we said, this is the moment where Paro is ascendant and the Plishtim are concerned about Paro, and the message is, turn your eyes not to the south, but to the north. Ko Amar Hashem, our usual prophetic introduction. Behold, waters are rising from the north. V'hayula nachal shotef. They will become a raging torrent. Right? We have, the notion of raging destructive waters is something which we're familiar with from, the desert. In the Negev, for example, when a sudden, flash flood can come, it literally is that, nachal shotef, like a flooding wadi of, instantaneous waters that can wash away, shepherding flocks that might be there, or not necessarily, there's not much for them to graze on, but that could wash away, wildlife that's there. V'yishtefu eret umloa, ir v'yosheveva. It will flood, wipe away, wash away the land and its fullness, the towns and their inhabitants. I couldn't, in hearing this, not think about the Psalm of the day for Sunday, what we read at the end of Shacharit on Sunday. We also say it when we're putting the Torah back away on weekdays and on Shabbat afternoon. LaDavid Mizmor, LaDonai haaretz umloa, tevel v'yoshveva. The earth is the Lord's and all that it holds. Aretz umloa, the world, tevel v'yoshveva. And here too we have that what these waters of the Babylonian destruction are going to wipe out is Eretz Umloa, and then instead of Tevel V'yoshveva, all habitation and those who dwell in it, it's Ir, a city, V'yoshveva, and its inhabitants. So there may be a sort of evoking the sense that this is, the Babylonians are the agents of God, and just like the whole earth and everything in it belongs to God, every, all habitation and those who dwell in it belong to God. So too, if it is God's will, those things can be wiped out as well. And of course, water is a very primordial, elemental force in creation and in destruction. People will cry out, and the inhabitants of the land will howl. Now we get, the Babylonians are not actually, the flooding is a metaphor. So what is the actual force of destruction? It's not water, but it's kol sha'atat parsot abirav, the clatter of the stamping hooves of the stallions or the mighty of the Babylonian, the northern, force. Me'ra'ash l'richbo hamon galgilav, and the noise of his chariots and the rumbling of their wheels. So you have this sort of very, onomatopoetic and, very descriptive feel of the clattering and stamping of the army coming on. Almost really does feel like, if you're somewhere where a rush of water is about to flood in, you sort of start to hear the noise from afar, and then it intensifies and kind of rushes upon you. And it's going to be so, immediate and intense that lo hifnu avot el banim. Parents won't even be able to turn to their children, right? Sort of the sense that when you have an onslaught of destruction, you can't even turn to anything around you. It's facing everybody at the same time. Merifyon yadayim, out of sheer helplessness, because of the day that is coming for ravaging all the Philistines. Lahachrit Letzor uletzidon kol sarid ozer. Right, so in a sense, now we go from the personal to the political. A parent couldn't even help their own child, and the regional allies will also be cut off from being able to provide aid. Kishoded Adonai et Plishtim, because God is going to ravage again the Ashdod sound there. The Philistines, Sherit I Kaftor, the remnants of the island of Kaftor, as we spoke about. Now we get a fascinating verse. Ba'a kolcha el Aza. Baldness has come upon Gaza. Ashkelon is destroyed, remnant of their valley. How long will you gash yourself? So baldness and gashing we're familiar with from the Torah's injunction about how we are not supposed to conduct ourselves in mourning, because that, which is in contrast to the way the other nations around us do it. This is in Deuteronomy chapter 14. Banim atem lashem elokechem. You are children of the Lord your God. Lo titgodedu, don't gash yourself. Lo tasimo kocha bein einechem lamet. And don't shave the front of your head because of the dead. So two reactions to death in the ancient Near East. One was shaving the front of your head, and one was gashing oneself, literally, self-harming as a method of showing grief. That's what other nations do. We are enjoined not to do that because we are banim lashem elokechem. We are children of God, either meaning, we are somehow more in the image of God, so we have to be more protective of our physical bodies, or maybe we don't experience loss in the same way that other nations do because we have God as our familial relation. So even if we lose, God forbid, a parent or a loved one, we still have the relationship with God, so we're less alone, despairing and grieving in some way. So don't titgodedu and don't tasimu kolcha. Now we come back to our verse, and we see, how long will you titgodedi, will you gash yourself? This is a statement to the Philistines. How long will you gash yourself? And how long will you, or you will now be struck with kolcha, baldness, or the shaving of the head? So it's clear that ad matai titgodedi, how long will you gash yourself, is a comment about, you're going to be in mourning, you're going to be grieving, and how, you'll be facing this instinct to self-harm for a while because of everything you're enduring. But baldness has come upon Gaza could mean two different things, and I think it is on purpose like a double entendre, a play on words. On the one hand, it means the, death and destruction in the sense that it instigates that shaving of the head. So baldness meaning signs of mourning have come upon Gaza, but it's also a description of the destruction, right? You talk like a scorched earth landscape almost looks like a shaved head instead of the, contours and textures of hair, rising and falling like buildings. Everything is shaved. So baldness has come upon Gaza. Both means the area has been leveled, and it also means, grief and destruction, mourning that follows after destruction has come. Obviously, one can look at some of the pictures and see that that is descriptive of the reality, certainly of some parts of Gaza today. And now there's sort of a voice which speaks out, and it's an interesting voice. We note, and Rabbi Silber in his podcast on this chapter notes, at the end of the previous chapter, the chapter about Egypt, we have two verses that contrast this to the Jewish people. Egypt needs to be afraid, but you, my servant Jacob, have no need to be afraid. You're going to be fine. Other nations will fall, but you will survive. But right before that, we noted that Egypt gets a little prophecy of consolation at the very end. After being handed over into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, it says, afterwards, after some period of destruction and or subjugation to Babylonia, Tishkon Kimei Kedem, Egypt will dwell securely, peacefully, like in former days. In the end of the prophecy for the Philistines, we don't get that little note of comfort. We don't have, and then things will be quiet again. In fact, we seem to have quite the opposite, almost as though we're expecting, anticipating or looking for that prophecy of things will settle down after the destruction. That's what's sort of being called for in this verse 6. Hoi cherev ladonai ad ana lo tishkoti, sword of the Lord. How long until you go quiet? When will you at last be quiet? Get yourself back into your hilt. Heragii vidomi, rest and be still. It's kind of a quite evocative, speaking to God's sword, speaking to the violence that is imagined to be coming forth from God, and saying, like, when will it end? And then the answer kind of comes from somewhere, from the narrator, from the kind of response maybe it's a rhetorical question, and the person who's asking it answers themselves. God's sword can't be put away until God has said so. So, eich tishkoti, right? Ad ana lo tishkoti, until when will you not be still and silent? Eich tishkoti, how can it or you be quiet? Vadonai tzivala, God has commanded that it is to be enforced, that the sword is to be utilized towards Ashkelon and towards the coast of the sea. It has been designated, Ya'adat has been sort of given its destiny or its assignment. So in contrast to the Egypt chapter, we end with kind of the request for, peace and comfort and restoration, and dwelling peacefully as in times past. But we're sort of told, until we get the message that that's going to happen, it can't happen. So that's how this short chapter about the Philistines and Gaza ends. Lance, and then we'll take other comments.
I just want to show you, Rob Stephen, how good you are. Here is a quotation from Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, clearly the #1 rabbinical commentary of our time. And he writes, the imagery here is elemental. Waters rising from the north symbolize an impending invasion, a metaphor for Babylonian forces poised to overwhelm the Philistines. Water, often a source of life and renewal, here becomes an agent of destruction. The universality of this imagery is striking. Every culture knows the terror of floods, the helplessness in the face of nature's unrelenting power. Jeremiah uses this shared experience to evoke the inescapability of divine judgment. That's #1. #2, you mentioned onomatopoeia. And I think if you look at rhetorical analyses of Tanach, you ain't going to find onomatopoeia. However, in Psalm 150, if I am correct, there are 2 references to symbols at the end of the psalm. I think it's tsiltzale, which to me is onomatopoetic.
Beautiful, beautiful.
So I thank you very much, and keep it up.
Thank you. Thanks for backing me up with good material, always, and adding new things. Dad and Mom?
Yes, if you can put up verse 2.
Okay, coming right up.
Okay, so the Philistines arrived at this location from the west. As seafarers, the way in which it's describing their taking over that coastline is their waters rising from the west, a raging torrent. They flooded the land and its creatures. This is how they captured the coastline. And now they're going to suffer the same thing, only it's going to be a torrent of horsemen from the north. So it's just measure for measure.
Yeah, beautiful, really nice insight. What they did to conquer the land ultimately was done to them, and then again we're still left with this question: what's the next phase after the sword of the Lord gets put back in its sheath? Does someone else come in and overtake? Do they get that peace and quiet? This chapter is not prepared to answer that question. Yeah, great. Other thoughts, comments on the chapter?
I think it's interesting that the Jeremiah would quote from Psalms.
Yes.
The same language. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So whenever we see the classics kind of scholarly point is whenever we see parallel language, in 2 different texts across the same corpus of literature, we always want to ask, did A influence B? Did B influence A? Or did A and B share the same proto influence or prior source? So, assuming, the classical ascription of Psalms to King David, obviously, it's totally possible that these, language like this was around, for 300, 400 years already, and Jeremiah was drawing off of it. It really does seem possible. And it's a lovely theme. This kind of it might have had a kind of a standing if you wanted to talk about, a significant area or something like that, or if you wanted to evoke kind of God's relationship to humanity, you would use this term, Eretz Umloa Yoshveva. So it really may be. I can't think of a time. We've certainly seen lots of parallels between Jeremiah and Devarim. I can't think of more on Psalms. So it may be an overread just to notice these parallels, but there's something interesting there. Yeah, thank you.
I think you said it was Psalm 24, is that right?
Yes, Psalm 24. Yeah. There are books. There's a book called Makbilot Bamikra, parallels in scripture, that kind of lines up where different books seem to share parallel texts. I haven't looked there to see whether there's more on the Jeremiah Psalms parallel. To be an interesting thing to explore and look into more. Yeah. Other thoughts? Okay, short. The Philistine chapter is short. That means class ends early today. So for all the times we ran over until 11:10, you get back a few minutes on this Thursday. And good wishes to everybody for a great rest of the week. Love to mom and dad, and see everybody next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.